Yo, man, what's up? There, I managed not to say hello in the way I always say hello. What do you think? Yo? Is that a suitable greeting? Yo, man, what's up? I sometimes teach a workshop to children in schools about register, so that's how formal that you should be when you write, and whether you should be formal or informal, and how you know which you are being. And yo, man, what's up? Is always something that I give them as an early example of imagine greeting, say, the Prime Minister in this fashion, or, the head teacher from another school, or even your own head teacher. Yo, man, what's up? Can just see my children saying that to our head teacher. She'd probably laugh, actually, but she would wonder what on earth had come over them. Anyway, I nearly succumbed to the temptation to do this in the garden today. I discovered that the internet stretches much further than I thought from our house, and it does get a long way outside. And since I've been working in the garden this afternoon, I've got one of those big bucket chairs. We've had it years and years and years, sort of like a gigantic bowl with a very puffy cushion. So I've been sitting out there doing a bit of work quietly because the children, because it's not school, seem to be very busy having a nice time on their own. And in fact, that was what did put me off doing it in the garden in the end, is because they're on the trampoline, which is graunching away because part of the outer ring is actually about to self-destruct. We've gone a bit wild and ordered a new trampoline. It'd be we bought this 8 years ago and it was second-hand then. And it's had hours and hours, probably months if you tucked it all together, of use over those last 8 years. So we decided we couldn't do it without. And of course you can't get one second hand at the moment. Not a chance. Because everybody's buying trampolines. And of course we're coming into the summer. So even people who hadn't already bought one are thinking about buying them. So anyway, we've got a new one coming just after half term. And I'm just hoping that this one doesn't finally give way. So there was them on the trampoline with their shouts and yowling and the graunching of the trampoline, and actually the road that I live on, I don't know, there goes somebody now, I don't know whether you can hear it on the background of this, but actually outside the traffic would be very noticeable. So, chapter 15, I didn't want you to be too distracted, or me either, come to that. Chapter 15 we've got to, so we've got 3 chapters left of this book. Yes, we've had the feast in the last chapter, which I loved, which was closing with the pageant, which actually was quite scary. It's a kind of play that's acted out, for people's entertainment, but this particular pageant, they were often about kind of moral tales, morality tales about good and evil and doing the right thing, and to sort of reinforce the teachings of the church. That if you didn't confess your sins before you died, you'd end up in purgatory. And this one, Lucy thinks that's what this one's going to be about, because it's got all these creatures following. There's this gigantic head that had knives for teeth that they've already seen. And with the procession, there's all these creatures with feathery backs and scaly limbs, and birds with horns and creeping things with silvery bodies and ridges of hair along their spines, slightly nightmarish. And they hold Joe and Lucy sort of shift themselves to the back of the crowd because they don't really want to be at the front, and suddenly there's somebody behind them. I'm just going to read the last little bit so that we pick up, okay? Lucy and Joe spun round. One of the demonic creatures from the procession hovered right behind them, its body covered with coarse fur, its wings spread high above its hooded head. The face inside the hood had been painted black, so that only the eyes and teeth gleamed in the light of the bonfire. The creature lowered its wings. Joe thought he saw firelight flash among the feathers on both sides. "Surely Mistress Lucy is not afraid?" "With her gallant saviour at her side," mocked the creature. Lucy made a whimpering sound. Joe stepped away from her. "It's all right," he said, without taking his eyes off the creature. "I know who this is, under the disguise." He cleared his throat and squared his shoulders. It's Tobias. You'll be fine. It's me he wants. Chapter 15. You? Why does he want you? Lucy's voice was shaking. That's right, isn't it? Joe said calmly to Tobias, and I think I know why. Tobias moved towards him. I want your St. Christopher, he snarled. Thanks to you, I've lost my job and all my hopes for the future. The least you can do is to give me a means of making a living. Joe felt anger swell in his chest. I didn't lose you your job. You lost your job when you brought the Falcon down like that. You nearly blinded Matthew. Tobias loomed over him. His blackened face was just inches away. Joe stood his ground, although his heart was thundering. Beneath one of Tobias's wings he saw the firelight flash again. What was that? The feathers weren't burning. It must be something else. Tobias growled. It was you who made the peregrine strike Matthew. If you hadn't frightened it, that would never have happened. It wasn't my fault, Joe said fiercely. I only put up my arm to protect myself. But Tobias carried on as though he hadn't spoken. What was the idea? Were you planning to step in for Matthew on the Mary Rose? Make yourself even more of a hero? He scoffed, as though the king would want a pathetic boy like you in the place of a man like Matthew. What are you talking about? Joe was bewildered. I wouldn't go on the Mary Rose for anything. I don't want to drown. Too late, he realised his mistake. He shut his mouth tight. Who said anything about drowning? Snapped the older boy. Anyway, you've got your St. Christopher to save you, haven't you? Joe didn't answer. Come now. Don't think you'll pull the same trick on me as you did on my cousin. Or don't you remember? Did your memory get wiped away when you disappeared? Still, Joe said nothing. Let's stop the pretence, Tobias snarled. We both know you're a witch. How else could you and your horse have vanished like that? All Robert did was pick up what you left behind, and yet he's the one that's locked up. He could hang you, realise, and it'll be your fault. I didn't mean that to happen, Joe said through gritted teeth. No? Tobias grinned without mirth. Never mind, maybe he'll just lose a hand, or have a red-hot iron seared into his flesh. There was another flash of firelight from beneath each wing. Suddenly, Tobias had a blade in each hand. He looked at Joe's face and laughed. I knew nobody would notice if the giant head was missing a couple of teeth. The light of the fire danced on the knives. Very slowly, Joe began to edge away towards the bonfire. If he could just get close enough, he could grab a burning stick. Go on, crooned Tobias. Go on. I'm not going to stop you backing into the fire. That would be perfect, don't you think? We like to hang our witches in England, but they do burn them in other countries. Do you know what burning flesh smells like? Meat. In spite of himself, Joe hesitated. Change your mind? Tobias sneered. Not going to throw yourself on the pyre? He sprang forward. The two blades crossed in front of him. They were almost touching Joe's cheeks. Give me the St. Christopher, then, before I do what the Falcon was meant to. In spite of himself, Joe flinched. With an enormous effort of will, he made himself look Tobias in the eye. He prayed that Lucy would keep quiet. Without shifting his gaze, he put one hand up to his collar, as though to draw out the St. Christopher from beneath his shirt. He tried desperately to think what to do. In a moment something would come to him. It would. It must. But his heart was pounding so hard he couldn't think straight. The blades were horribly close to his face. If Tobias gashed his cheeks, it would leave terrible scars. He'd never explained those away at home. But what if the older boy meant to blind him? Joe's throat tightened. He tried to swallow. He tried to breathe the hissing air. The firelight dimmed. His knees crumpled beneath him. He heard Lucy shout. He was fainting with fear. He felt ashamed and angry at himself. In a moment Tobias would reach down and find there was no St. Christopher around his neck, and then he would turn on Lucy. "Are you okay?" The words seemed to explode above Joe. Light glared behind his eyelids. He huddled away from it, back down into the darkness inside himself. "Excuse me, does anyone know where this boy's parents are?" Joe groaned. The voice was deafening and the light painful. Sick rushed into his mouth and spurted all over the floor beside him. "Oh dear," said the voice. "I'm glad I wasn't standing there. Poor you. Don't worry, we'll find your mum in a minute." Joe kept his eyes firmly shut. He knew he must be back in his own world, and he was immensely grateful to have escaped from Tobias. But there was no way he could hold a conversation with a stranger. Other voices gathered around him, talking to each other, asking him questions. He didn't even try to answer. He felt sicker and more disorientated than he'd ever done coming out of Lucy's world. "Joe?" There was a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Joe." Dad was lifting him into a sitting position, wiping his face with a tissue. "Here, have some water." Joe took the bottle Dad held out. His father looked worried. Of course he would be, finding Joe collapsed on the floor like this. "What happened?" Dad asked. "Are you ill? Well, obviously you are." He glanced at the person clearing up the sick. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "He was fine 2 minutes ago. I don't know what's come over him." "Not to worry," said the man. "Our first aider will be here in a minute." "No," Joe protested weakly. "I'm fine. I don't need anything. I expect it was just the heat." "The heat? But it's not hot, Joe. It's April." "Honestly, I'm fine." But there was no avoiding it. The woman with the first aid kit took his temperature and pulse and insisted he spend 15 minutes sitting on the chair she'd brought for him. Joe felt like a total fraud. It didn't stop there, of course. When Dad dropped Sam and Joe home at the end of the holiday, Mum took Joe straight to the doctor's. "I don't understand it," she told the GP. "There's no pattern to it. The first time was after breakfast at a railway station. Then he had that episode in the classroom just sitting at his desk, and this time he was visiting a castle with his dad." "Did you feel different at all before it happened?" the doctor asked Joe. "What, apart from being in a different world?" Joe wanted to say. "No," he answered. "I was fine before and I was fine afterwards. I feel completely normal. There's nothing wrong with me." The doctor smiled. "You seem very sure." She turned back to Joe's mum. "His blood pressure is okay. His urine's normal. There's nothing obvious. It might possibly have been low blood sugar, but it's still rather unusual for a boy of his age to faint without some sort of trigger. I'd like to do some blood tests if you don't mind." "Of course," Mum said. The tests came back clear, as Joe had known they would. "I think we should refer him to a specialist," the doctor said at the follow-up appointment. "I'm fine," Joe insisted. It was such a waste of time. He decided to forget all about it for now. In any case, there were plenty of more important things to think about. The day he'd got back from Wardour, he'd looked up the Mary Rose. Lucy had been right. It hadn't been the ship's maiden voyage. She'd already served in 2 wars and been refitted with new weaponry. But he'd been right about the other part. She had sunk in 1545, just outside Portsmouth Harbour, during a battle with the French. That had to be the same battle that Matthew was going to fight in. Straight away he'd looked to see if he could find any record of Lucy's brother on the ship, or among the handful of survivors. But it seemed there was no list anywhere of who'd been on board. Had Lucy's brother gone on the Mary Rose? Or had Lucy found a way of stopping him? Joe longed to know, but the only way to find out was to go back. Yet it would be much too risky to return to Lucy's world now. Have come back from Nunney Castle, so everyone would know that William Paulet didn't have a page by the name of Joseph Hopkins, nor had he lost a horse. Joe wondered what Lucy's family had made of it. They probably assumed he'd been some kind of an imposter, he thought a little sadly. In a way, they were right. But the thing that would make his situation really dangerous if he did go back was that he'd accidentally referred to the sinking of the Mary Rose to Tobias moments before he'd disappeared in front of him. If just a few weeks had passed there and the ship had gone down, people would believe Tobias this time when he claimed that Joe was a witch. Over the next couple of weeks, Joe spent every free moment trying to find out about witches in Tudor England. The ones he'd found seemed mostly to be women or occasionally old men. There were no children who'd been accused, as far as he could see. All the same, he Googled his own name, just in case there was a Joseph Hopkins who'd been condemned to death in 1545. There was nothing, fortunately. But that didn't stop him worrying, and the descriptions he found of ritual hanging made him sick with fear. "What's going on?" Dad asked, when Joe and Sam went to stay with him for the weekend again. "I was talking to your mum on the phone yesterday. She says you're not eating properly, and she's found you wandering around the house in the night a couple of times. Are you worried about seeing the specialist?" Joe shook his head. "There's nothing wrong with me," he said gruffly. "Is something else worrying you then?" Joe hesitated. "Your mum said you'd been spending a lot of time looking into witchcraft. Are you doing a project at school?" "No." "What then?" "I was just thinking—" Joe broke off. Dad waited. "I was thinking that people talk about medieval punishments, like being burnt at the stake or hung, drawn and quartered, but they never really think about what it might feel like." He swallowed. "You know, the actual physical pain." "Isn't that for the best?" Dad said gently. "What would be the point in imagining a horrific experience like that when it's never going to happen?" All at once, tears were streaming down Joe's cheeks. He tried to find the words to explain, but couldn't. It was all right for Dad to say that it would never happen. It would never happen to Dad. But it might happen to him. He sobbed. Dad put his arms around Joe. "Now then," he murmured, "there's no need to get so upset. Are you having nightmares?" Joe nodded, rubbing his cheeks with his sleeve. "Since when?" He sniffed. "Since we went to Wardour." "That's strange. Wasn't exactly a hotbed of witchcraft." Dad handed Joe a handkerchief. "Shall I tell you what I do when I've heard about something that frightens me? While I'm waiting to go to sleep, I lie there and deliberately think about it for a few moments. I don't dwell on it, but I call it into my mind, think about it for maybe 10 seconds, and then push it away and think about something else." "Doesn't that make the nightmares worse?" "No, I find it stops them. Funny, isn't it? I wonder if maybe calling the scary things into your conscious mind pulls them out of your subconscious, so they're not there anymore when your brain goes looking for stuff to make into dreams." So that night, while Joe was lying in bed, he thought about Tobias in his winged costume. He imagined Tobias accusing him of witchcraft, pointing and screaming at him. There was a hissing sound in his ears. Joe frowned. Lucy hadn't been part of the scene he'd been imagining. He hadn't been thinking about her at all. The hissing must be something else. He pulled the pillow up around his ears, trying to block out the noise. A moment later, he was standing in the middle of the castle compound, exactly where he'd been when he disappeared. He clutched his hands together in panic. There was no pillow now, nothing to cling on to. How had this happened? This was exactly what he didn't want. The sky was dark except for stars. The bright edge of a cloud showed where the moon was hidden behind it. He looked all around. There was nobody in the compound. It was obviously the middle of the night, but a different night from the one he'd left. That was just as well, he thought. His best chance of keeping safe would be to avoid people as much as possible. He still needed to find Lucy, though. He walked around the castle to the side where her bedroom was. The window was shuttered like all the others. He knew she must be awake behind it, though, since she'd called him here. At the foot of the wall, on the next corner along from Lucy's room, he saw a doorway he'd forgotten about. He crept through the garden towards it, wincing at the noise of his feet on the gravel path. His heart was thumping in his chest. As carefully as he could, he turned the handle. The door creaked open. He froze, waiting for someone to pounce on him or to call out and demand his name. But nobody did. Inside was the staircase that led up to the room where Lady Jane's maid had brushed off Joe's clothes. 2 floors above that must be the room with the furs. He rubbed his forehead, trying to remember the exact layout. Lucy's room had been on the 2nd floor, but if he went up the staircase to that level, he would have to creep through her parents' bedchamber first. That would be risky, or he could go right to the top and tiptoe through the 3rd floor rooms, but he didn't know who was sleeping up there. In front of him was another door, which must lead into the ground floor room with the latrine. Better to sneak through there and out into the courtyard, he decided. Cautiously, he pushed the door open. From inside there came loud snoring from the men and boys sleeping on the mattresses on the floor. Joe was amazed they could sleep at all. The smell of the latrine was even worse than he remembered. He felt his way in the darkness, stepping gingerly over outstretched arms and legs. If any of the sleepers stirred, they would hopefully just think he was one of the others getting up to go to the loo. On the other side of the room, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the courtyard. The cool night air was wonderfully fresh. He stood for a moment, looking up at the shuttered windows all the way round. In front of him, the well with its little roof stood silent in the moonlight. Joe checked that there was nobody watching, then scurried to the staircase in the next corner and up 2 flights. Outside Lucy's door, he hesitated. It was this one, wasn't it? It could be a disaster if he blundered into the wrong room, especially since it was going to be too dark for him to see very much. He pushed open the door. There was the soft sound of breathing. "Lucy," he whispered. He'd expected her to react immediately. After all, she must have been thinking about him only a few minutes ago. But there was no reply. Perhaps she'd fallen asleep again. "Lucy." He tiptoed towards the bed. He could barely make out anything at all in the blackness, but he thought he could hear the breathing of 2 or even 3 people. Hadn't Lucy said she shared a room with Anne, and Cecily too when she was at home? They might all 3 be sleeping in the same bed, and there was probably a servant in here too, sleeping on the floor somewhere. The curtains around the bed were drawn back. Joe squinted in the gloom. The girl lying nearest to him was wearing a white cap. Beneath it, a long, dark plait lay across the pillow. Holding his breath, Joe bent down as close as he dared. It was definitely her. "Lucy," he whispered into her ear. She rolled over but didn't wake. "Lucy." He put a hand on her shoulder. She mumbled something and then opened her eyes. "Joe," she said, sitting bolt upright. "Shh." He put his finger to his lips. "What on earth are you doing here?" she whispered. "I didn't mean to startle you, sorry. You called me, so I assumed you'd be awake." "Called you?" She looked baffled. "No, I didn't." "With the St. Christopher," he persisted. "Like I explained before, You must have touched it a few minutes ago while you were thinking of me. No, I definitely didn't. She yawned. I've been asleep for hours, I think. And I know for sure that I didn't call you, because I haven't got your St. Christopher anymore. So, where is it? Who's got it? I'm sure you can take an educated guess as to where it might be. She hasn't got it, so she didn't call him here. And yet he is here. So we have 2 more chapters left, so we'll have chapter 16 tomorrow. Same time, Wednesday, 5 o'clock. Hope to see some of you then.